Welcome everyone to another Medtech program. I'm Rachel Robinson, COO of Medtech, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you all virtually and in person. I have to say it's a little strange, it may take me a minute to adjust, so I hope you will all bear with me today. We do have a wonderful event planned for you, and I'm so thrilled to be able to thank Abiomed for hosting us and this outstanding program of speakers, which we will get into later. But I couldn't start off without thanking a number of people, including Abiomed and our sponsors. And I'm also smart enough to know, after 2 years of programming, that you need to write everything down. So you'll excuse me if I look at my notes quite a bit, because I will forget. Sunrise Labs, Boston Engineering, Goddard, Active Surgical, and Sunstein Law have been outstanding supporters of this program. They are sponsoring us throughout the year. And so please join me in saying a very big thank you to them. We could not do it without their support. So thank you for that. I am going to thank our speakers. You're going to be incredibly impressed by the information that they shared today, but I will let them introduce themselves in just a little bit. I do want to plug our next couple of events, so please keep your eyes open for save the dates for our next 3 Women in MedTech programs. We'll be doing 3 more hybrid programs this year, and we'd really love to have you be a part of those. So if you are not already registered for the Medtech email list, you can do that at massmedic.com. You can also email myself or one of the team. We would love to have you on that list. It's where we share events. If you are also not a part of the LinkedIn Medtech Women in MedTech group, that is a thing. We started it earlier in the year. We've got about 150 members at this point. You can absolutely join that. It's where we share all of our crucial and critical information about women's issues, as well as give you an opportunity to share what's important to you when it comes to hiring, anything that's got to do with fundraising, and honestly, initiatives like this. So things like this are incredibly important to us as an organization, and we'd love your thoughts and your feedback on it. So I wanted to start off by setting the stage for why we're here for this particular program. If you didn't get a chance to take a look at the many links that were sent to you about the FDA's strategic initiative or grab one off the table out there, we do have more. It's what we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about today. So I highly suggest that you do that. If you need some, we do have more copies. But to set the stage, I want to read a little bit of what FDA's strategic initiative laid out in their press release. They said, now more than ever, we need to understand the implications sex and gender present for the performance of medical devices in all individuals. The CDRH Health of Women program is a comprehensive, collaborative landmark program built on the premise that both sex and gender have a considerable impact on women's overall health, not just their reproductive or sexual health. With patients at the heart of the initiative and with the strategic plan as a blueprint for the center's priorities, Health of Women intends to ensure all women have access to innovative, safe, and effective medical technology. So that's what we're here to talk about today. They do break it down into a few things, and that's what we're going to base our discussion on. But before I did that, I wanted to introduce Melissa Schooley, the Senior Director of Corporate Health and Policy at Government Affairs, who is going to intro a very special video that we had the pleasure of having made right before this.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Excellent introduction there. I'm Melissa Schooley. I'm our Senior Director for Government Affairs and Reimbursement Policy for Abiomed. Today we have a welcome message from one of our members of the Massachusetts delegation, Representative Lori Trahan. Lori represents the 3rd District in Massachusetts. She grew up in Lowell, and she was the first member of her family to graduate college. She earned her scholarship for playing Division I volleyball and got into Georgetown University, and she's talked about how meaningful that experience was and what allowed her to go to college. She then worked for Marty Meehan and ultimately became his chief of staff. After that, she was in the private sector as the only female executive at a tech company. Her passion for bringing women into leadership positions led her to be a co-founder of a women-owned and operated consulting firm. She successfully ran for Congress in 2018 and now serves on the very powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee, and importantly for us here, also the Health Subcommittee. Lori's focused on making health care more affordable and accessible for women, and has been a strong partner to the medical technology industry. She really understands the important role that MedTech is in the overall healthcare ecosystem. Last month, during Heart Month, Representative Trahan introduced a bipartisan resolution which calls for more education and awareness and inclusion of women, in particularly, in cardiovascular clinical trials. She also talked about the need to address barriers, just like those addressed in the CDRH report, and the importance of education on technologies that can enable heart recovery and generally improve the quality of life for women. Although she's out of the country this week on a CODEL, and she couldn't join us today, she wanted to make sure that she sent her message of support and collaboration to us. So without further ado, I'll ask the team to introduce Lori.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking part in the Women in Medtech Forum today. I'm grateful for MassMedic's invitation to join you all. And while I wish I could be at a biomed today in person, I'm glad I could participate virtually in this critical discussion. There's a clear need to improve the participation rate of women in the development of medical devices and other therapies. Clinical trial diversity in particular is an area I'm committed to improving through thoughtful policymaking and collaboration with key stakeholders like all of you. As a member of the Health Subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, I've had opportunities to ask regulators and industry leaders pointed questions about this important topic. And I've also advanced policies to improve gender diversity in research and development. Some of the folks participating in this forum have helped with these efforts, and I'm thankful for your contribution. Moving forward, I'll continue to seek out, create, and leverage those opportunities, and I ask that you all continue to push from your side as well. I'm encouraged by the FDA's ongoing efforts, particularly CDRH's Health of Women Strategic Plan, and I'm even more encouraged by the women participating in today's forum. Improving medical device research and development will improve health outcomes for women, but there's no question that achieving that goal requires the efforts of women. So thank you all for doing the work, and please know that I'm 100% behind you. This challenge demands meaningful collaboration between women in industry, women at the FDA, and women in Congress, and I'm honored to be your partner in the House of Representatives. Thank you all again.
So please join me in thanking Representative Trahan for obviously sending that video and really supporting and championing this big, important mission and a big, important cause. And Melissa, thank you and your team for relentlessly chatting with her about all of these topics and making sure that she's aware of what obviously you all are doing, but what MassMedic is doing. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so before I introduce our speakers, I want to just lay some ground rules about questions. We highly encourage them. So if you are in person and want to ask a question, please make sure to wait for the handheld mic. You can absolutely raise your hand at any time. We encourage comments. This is meant to be more of a roundtable discussion and dialogue. We have a lot of things on our mind to talk about, but please feel free to chime in. Virtually, you can absolutely put your questions into the chat. One of our team members is going to be monitoring those, and we want to make sure you get those answered as well. So let's make this as interactive as possible, really with the understanding that this is not going to be a discussion that ends today. This is going to be a discussion that continues for a very long time, and we want to make sure that we understand what is top of mind for all of you. So with that, I would like to say thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves because it's much better than me trying to do it. But Stephanie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this really exciting event. Stephanie Baker, I am the VP of Regulatory for the surgical franchise within the Alcon organization. I've been with that organization about a year now. You might be thinking, geez, isn't that a Texas-based company? Why are you participating in a MassMedic event? But I do live in Massachusetts and do want to continue to stay connected to biotech in this area. So with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague here.
We have better weather than Texas, right?
It's about 80 degrees in Texas right now,
nice.
or over the weekend,
nice.
so I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But.
Well, my name is Sonia Vavsar, and likewise, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really excited about this topic and to have this group discussion. I work here at Abiomed. I've been with the company for about 10 years and really had the opportunity to actually grow personally and develop my career here in different functions. And I currently serve as the Associate Director of the Surgical and Pediatrics Platform, so our engineering team.
Great, thank you, Sonia. and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be part of this group. While I have a BS in mechanical engineering, I spent most of my career at the bedside of patients as an advanced heart failure cardiologist and joined Abiomed a year and a half ago, where I have the pleasure of leading our women's health initiative and serving as the medical lead for our clinical trials in the surgical space.
Hi, I'm Jessica Sachs. I'm a senior design mechanical engineer at Goddard Technologies, which is a product development firm here in Massachusetts. I've been there for about 2 years, but prior to that, have a lot of experience in medical device, primarily looking at breast oncology and a lot of other women-facing technologies. Again, thank you so much for having me speak here on this panel. I'm very excited for this discussion.
Okay, so if you have the initiative in front of you, or if you've reviewed it, you'll understand that it's broken down into 3 major sub-points. And we're gonna each tackle kind of one of those separately. We've got some questions and comments, but we'd love your, like I said, your comments as well. The first one is around sex and gender-specific analysis and reporting. So according to the FDA's initiative, their goal is to improve availability, analysis, and communication of sex and gender-specific information for the safe and effective use of medical devices, to improve and better understand the performances of medical devices in women, optimize practices for consistent sex and gender-specific data collection, analysis and reporting, and to ensure their policies are current. So I'd like to think about this in 2 veins when it comes to sex and gender-specific analysis and reporting. I think the first is getting critical feedback from women in the design phase of product development, and then I think it's in specific clinical trials development. So before we kind of start off to what should be, I was hoping, Bobby, that you might be able to kind of set the stage. In a lot of our pre-calls, we've talked about some of the challenges of designing devices specifically for women early on, but maybe you could kind of share how far we've come.
Well, in the early phases of clinical trials, at least in the setting of heart failure, we enrolled 0 women, even in medical therapy trials. But the early device trials, for example, with the AbioCor, or total artificial heart, it was so large, it was hard to fit in many men, and 0 women were enrolled in the clinical trial. So I can say, I'm happy to say we've come a long way. We now have an Impella device that is very small, that will fit in most all women, and allows access to women for medical device therapy. The clinical trial piece, we're still struggling. We now have certainly encouragement from FDA and CMS about sex-specific reporting. And at Abiomed, we've made that an initiative for all of our clinical trials. We pre-specify sex so that we can build our statistical plan around looking at sex-specific analysis of all of our clinical trials. So that is critical to determine that the devices are safe and effective for women as well as men.
So we've made strides, I think, as an industry. I think that's a safe bet. But obviously, there's still so much more that we could do. Jess and Sonia, I'm hoping you guys could maybe go into some current best practices, like especially when it comes to human factors, testing, protocols. When you're really in those design phases, how do you go about getting more women actively involved? And what are some best practices for setting up that kind of stuff? I don't know who wants to go first.
I might go first, because yes, AbioCor was very large, and luckily I don't have to take credit for that. But in any case, we are with the world's smallest heart pump. But it's true, when you're designing medical devices very early on in the design process, really before you're even thinking about commercialization, it's back in the research realm, you're thinking about who you're designing for, right? So it's form, fit, and function. And I think a lot of that is, it's important to consider who your patient populations are. So as Bobby alluded to, there's a lot more research that needs to be done to understand the realm of cardiovascular disease in the female population or in sex-specific populations. But then being able to distinguish that and understand when you're designing a medical device, how is this going to fit within the patient that you're designing it for? And so I think that's something that we do on the engineering side quite often. When you look at some of our devices, I'm going to think specifically about our Impella RP. It's a right-sided device. The right side of the heart is very complex, especially when you're trying to go from the inferior vena cava all the way to the pulmonary artery. In order to design that, we take a lot of CT scans. They're patient-specific CT scans. And then we try to develop a design that fits a majority of your target population, knowing that there will always be a statistical probability that you fall outside of it. So I think that's a way that engineering really does incorporate something that is specific, I would say patient-specific into the design. And of course, patient-specific comes with sex and gender-specific considerations.
The other thing to consider too with human factors and upfront design work is not just the it's going to be used on, whether it's male or female, but also the user base as well. There's certain areas of surgeons and nurses and doctors that are either very male oriented or female oriented. So when you're making a device, you want it to be universal. One thing that I've worked on in the past was just hand sizing. It was a device that had 2 buttons on it, but because the original device was larger, clunkier, women who had smaller hands and these surgeons were unable to function with the device. So we did a lot of upfront studies and early formative and summative studies to really dial in that user studies to make sure that we were making a device that was going to be friendly for all surgeons.
So we're going to talk about this a little bit later about the business case, but when you talk about setting up formative, summative testing, obviously that stuff is very expensive. And for small companies especially, but also large companies, you run into the, how do I make this work for the most amount of people without blowing my budget and having to go raise another $20 million. I'd love to kind of talk about that a little bit, especially when it comes to understanding those user groups. How do you make something for the largest group of users, because that may rule out understanding what it's going to do to people of sex and different genders?
Well, I can take that. I think that a lot of times when we say, how do you make something for specific groups, right? Like for the smaller hands, what you're really asking is, this product works a certain way or it has a certain form and function right now that doesn't work for certain parts, and it's a new challenge. It's an engineering challenge. How can we make it better? And I think that oftentimes, at least what I've learned through my experience in the last 10 years, is if you're making it better because you're facing the new challenge, you've learned a lot about your device and your technology, and ultimately that investment makes it better across the board. It's never trying to exclude a group when you're learning something new that makes the product a little bit better or more easier to use within a certain subset.
Stephanie, I wanted you to maybe chime in on this topic because obviously with the eye, sex and gender may actually not make that big of an impact on how you design your product. So I wonder if you might talk through kind of Alcon's approach a little bit, especially when it comes to surgical tools, but also just broadly.
Yeah, I can, and I think it all starts with the science, right, and doing an assessment for the type of product that you have, and can gender and sex actually impact patient outcomes. And as we think about the ophthalmology space and we consider that, and I'll talk a bit about the portfolio that Alcon offers, the answer in general terms is no, right? So we've got a pretty broad portfolio from a pharmaceutical perspective and also from a medical device or implant equipment portfolio perspective. And so, you can go to the store and see a lot of our products, right? We've got contact solutions, we've got drops, we've got contact lenses, and then we also have intraocular lenses, delivery systems, equipment for cataract and vitreoretinal procedures. We also have equipment for LASIK procedures, so a pretty broad portfolio. And as you consider all of that and you say, okay, are there gender differences as we study patients who are using some of these products, like an intraocular lens, for instance? The answer is no, and often what we find as you consider our patients, in many cases, patients who need, say, an intraocular lens are part of an aging population, and what we find is most of the time females outlive males, and so in some cases males are actually underrepresented in some of our studies, which is interesting. So from that perspective, in the ophthalmology space, the types of products that we have, say maybe on the med device side, we really don't see an impact, and we've been able to enroll pretty equivalent male-female populations. If you consider some of our pharmaceutical products and their mechanisms of action, more generally they're acting locally, not systemically, where you might expect to see some impact based on gender. So across the board, from an ophthalmology perspective, we don't see as much of an impact as we might see in the cardiovascular space. Where we do, though, and I'd like to weigh in, is what you all were talking about previously from an ergonomic perspective. As I'm newer to the ophthalmology space, what I've noticed is the surgeon population is heavily female. And if you think about the anatomy of the eye, it's very intricate, and there's a high level of precision, and what we see is that there are a lot lot of female surgeons, in some cases even more than men, in the ophthalmology space. And because of that, we need to design certain products to be able to fit their hand size. So if you're thinking about, a delivery system for an intraocular lens, or you're thinking of a handpiece for cataract or a vitret piece of equipment, we really need to make sure that we're designing with the female surgeon in mind. So it comes into play when you're thinking about those aspects from an ergonomic perspective, but just interesting to think about this as it pertains to the ophthalmology portfolio, and the products that we've got to date not being as impacted as maybe the cardiovascular space. So I'll turn it back over to you.
No, I love that anecdote about female surgeons. I think that's actually really interesting and not something that you would always assume. And industry is just every area is so specific, and you have to, again, you have to plan for everything while not excluding anything and somehow justify it as a business. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, especially as we shift to clinical trials. So let's talk about how we engage more diverse groups. We've had a really great conversation to prep around some of the things that keep women from enrolling, some of the incentives, and how we can kind of get creative in our approach. Bobby, Sonia, Jess, I know we talked a little bit about this in the prep call. Maybe, Bobby, you could start out with your perspective on women in clinical trials.
So women have been underrepresented in device-based trials in the cardiovascular space, and women tend to be more risk averse across any decision making, and that's exacerbated in the setting of stress when they're approached about a clinical trial. So that has influenced how we approach women, and really being able to educate our research coordinators to have more in-depth conversations with women about the risk, develop patient-specific brochures that appeal to women about the risk of trials, and encourage more interaction with the decision-making piece of being part of a clinical trial will help encourage more women to be part of clinical trials.
Yeah, there's an issue here with a lot of women have that barrier to entry, whether it's because they are the child care provider or the household management. So they have, again, like you said, risk adverse because the incentive isn't there. They're now doing things that are going to take weeks or months on end of their lives and put other things on the back burner. So there's that whole barrier to entry.
And we've seen actually in surveys, women tend to respond very well to financial compensation. They are primary caregivers, not just for children, but for spouses and aging parents. So it's an additional cost to them to participate in a clinical trial. They have to offset those costs of having someone care for whoever they are a caregiver, as well as transportation cost. So again, that's where Melissa and our advocacy partners help us to be able to overcome some barriers by IRBs that see financial compensation as incentivizing patients to be part of a trial rather than offsetting a barrier that prevents women from enrolling.
That's really interesting about an incentive versus, the offset, because I think that is really important, and it's not something we necessarily talk about a lot. We expect people to want to be a part of things, but we don't necessarily understand the motivations for why they'd want or need what they need to be a part of things. So if you're giving up not just your time, it's your finances as well, and you have to understand how you're going to be compensated for that.
The additional benefit for women is if we provide the opportunity for a virtual follow-up. Again, they're not having to leave the home. There's not the transportation issue or the caregiver issues. So that does assist women to be part of clinical trials if we can at least give them the opportunity to have a virtual follow-up.
Sonia, what's your perspective from this from a pediatric stance? I mean, obviously, that's something you and I bonded over pretty closely on our prep call. Yeah. But that's obviously such an interesting market. I would love for you to chat about that. I'm not going to lead you in one way or direction or another, but when it comes to especially clinical trials for pediatric products.
Well, I think that just as there's this initiative now with the CDRH, you probably remember many years ago, probably 15 years ago, there was something called the Pumpkin trials, or it was pumps for kids, infants, and neonates. That's what Pumpkin stood for, and it was for the same thing. There was an area of national need. There was an underserved patient population that wasn't getting the devices out there, the attention. And a lot of it has to do, again, with offsetting costs and knowing when you're designing for, right, if it's a very specialized population, is there a way to make it a business or, make it sustainable? So I think we did talk about this a lot. There haven't been that many studies out there. It's kind of one of these things where I think some of these special population groups get creative with what is available on the market and understanding how they can adapt those devices or those therapies to be fitted for their population. I think there's a continued push from the FDA to try to pursue or continue to get more on-label use for pediatrics. A lot of it is also a pediatric trial, you can imagine, is something that is very challenging to conduct. So when we talk about the incentives or the reasons to have a female enter into a clinical study, the idea of doing a clinical trial, maybe if it's even randomized with children, just has its own kind of reaction internally, right? There's something that you just kind of have a feeling about, and I think that's always been a challenge for industry to go after something like a clinical trial. So I think the FDA is working very closely with industry partners to look at real-world evidence, especially because there are so many institutions that are utilizing the approved devices in the adult side, and they're finding applications of where it can be utilized in a special population like a pediatric, and working together with their industry partners to bring that to be on-label use.
I'd love to talk about the business case. So, I'll be honest. When I first saw this initiative, I thought, great, this is great. We want more focus on women and gender, and we want there to be equal inclusion. Then the momentary thing that kind of snapped into my head was, what does this do to innovation? What am I going to tell startups about what they need to do and who they need to include? Does this mean that companies are not going to have as much of an opportunity? And I started to see the negatives. I'm happy after talking with all of you that you encouraged me with some positives, and Nicole on my team also thought the same way. But I'd love to talk about how you justify this as a business, adding more money, potentially more patients to clinical trials that may or may not actually impact the use or the design of your device. I'd love your thoughts.
Well, I can start. Since the mid-1980s, more women than men have died every year of cardiovascular disease. Yet, when you look at clinical trials, women make up less than 25% of the participants for clinical trials. So if you're looking at the potential market space, we're missing a lot of the market because we're not appealing to women for devices. So by encouraging enrollment of women, we get more evidence for safety and efficacy for women. And I was pleased to see a recent manuscript published that was just presented at CSRC last Friday that including diversity in clinical trials did not increase the time of enrollment to completion of the trials, nor did it increase the number of protocol deviations. So that was very reassuring that we can do this and expand the diversity in our clinical trials without stalling innovation or slowing down enrollment in clinical trials.
Stephanie, I love what you said on our call about the justification. Maybe you could share that. I don't know if you remember the comment you made, but we were talking about this, and you made a comment that sometimes you can spend so much time justifying why you shouldn't do it, you've actually spent more money than if you just went and did it.
Yeah, I think too, just in its simplest form, it's the right thing to do, right? You want the data and the evidence that you generate in your trials to be representative of your patient population and the patients that you're trying to treat and help. And in my mind, I really don't necessarily think, based on what you said with the manuscript, that it's going to add that much time to the trial. You might have to be creative. You might have to enroll more sites. You might have to think a different way about your trial design. But in the end, I think you're going to get more meaningful data that you will hit a broader patient base, and ultimately the revenues are going to come from that. I also think we need to be creative in using registries, you mentioned real-world evidence, and maybe analyzing existing data in a different way, right? FDA is promoting this heavily. The use of registries in certain pockets of therapeutic areas. And I think we really, as industry, need to leverage that more and partner with the agency more and try to be more creative, because there's a lot of evidence out there today that we could be tapping into as well. So, again, ultimately, as an organization, it comes down to dollars and cents, but I really do think if your data is compelling and you can hit that broader patient base, you can sell and attract to that broader patient base. So I don't view it as a negative necessarily.
That's good to hear. Good, made me more optimistic. Okay, so that was the first bullet point of FDA's initiative. There are 2 more, but before we move on, I did want to take a moment and see if there were any questions before we move on. Anybody online have questions, Nicole? Okay, good. Well then, let's move on to the second bullet point. The second bullet point is an integrated approach for current and emerging issues related to the health of women. So the goal is to strengthen internal health science programs and initiatives across CDRH, working together with CDRH offices and stakeholders to create actions that aim to improve the overall health and quality of life for women. Coordinate and lead an integrated approach to analyze current and emerging issues related to the health of women, explore innovative strategies, technologies, and device-specific study paradigms, and develop center-wide policies and outreach activities related to the health of women. That's a handful right there. So I'd like to start off by saying, and it's a question, are we doing enough to educate women on the way different diseases and medical conditions affect them? Bobby and Sonia, maybe you guys can share a little bit more about some of the specific cardiac issues that we talked about that, not only affect women differently than men, but present differently than men.
Most of what I've learned has actually been from Bobby, so I'm gonna let her. She's taught me so, and I honestly mean that. She has taught me so much about, things that affect my health that I was not aware of, even working in this industry.
So certainly for women in the setting of myocardial infarction, they present differently. They are more likely to present with atypical symptoms. 10% of the time, it's just jaw discomfort. It's not the typical crushing elephant on your chest that you think of. That's much more common in men, but not so much in women. And let's face it, women have a higher pain threshold than men. We just do. And when we present, we're usually not an extremist as men. So often, they're not appreciated. It's true. I can tell.
Those are getting quoted later, by the way.
But in ERs, women are more often sent out with a diagnosis of a panic attack when their anxiety was related to shortness of breath due to fluid buildup from their heart attack. They're actually discharged from the ER more likely with that diagnosis of panic attack, and their heart attack is missed. I've seen over the course of my career women who went to even a cardiologist and were sent out of their office to walk across the street to the ER and have a myocardial infarction. So they're very subtle, and we actually just recently looked at our STEMI DTU clinical protocol, and one of the inclusion criteria was chest pain. And we found that in a lot of women, they don't necessarily have chest pain. So we had to remove that to say it could be atypical chest pain or an atypical symptom of a myocardial infarction. So it's important to understand the biologic differences in men and women, the different presentations in men and women when you're designing clinical trials and attempting to recruit women to your trials.
So how do we educate more? Are we doing enough from an education standpoint, as we populate the ideas of human factor studies, we populate the ideas of clinical trials, is there hesitancy because women don't really know what can affect them and how? So how can we do better to educate?
And certainly I've seen that, and I remember 30 years ago when I was in CCU rounds, and we would have, and again, it's in the mid-80s, more women are dying than men, but even among physicians, we would say male sex was a risk factor for a myocardial infarction, not female sex, when the reality was more women were actually dying. So we've had to start with educating our providers. And the AHA Go Red campaign that started to really educate both the community as well as providers about the risk of cardiovascular disease in women is important, but there's still so much work to be done. And we have many more opportunities to educate both our community as well as our healthcare providers and those in Medtech who design clinical trials.
Sonia, I love what you said about having learned everything from Bobby, because it's not just the public that needs to be educated, right? You are the people making medical devices. We are the people who do the work. So the more we educate the public, great, but we also need to have an understanding in industry of what those disease states, what those conditions are, and what the repercussions are.
And some of them are still unknown, right? So I think that's part of what this initiative is, to better understand the sex-specific outcomes with medical devices in female populations. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about a little bit too, which is encouraging more research, more investigation into this. You know, if you think about why does everybody know the classic symptoms of a heart attack, or it's a risk factor to be a man to have a heart attack, right? It's because there was a study associated with it that was published and it was taught in medical schools. It was advertised, or you know, there was a news article or something about it. And I think that's what this is encouraging, is to continue that research and understanding and do the analyses on sex specific for us to have a better understanding.
It also requires cross-collaboration even among medicine. For example, women who are pregnant that develop either eclampsia or preeclampsia are at much higher risk of cardiovascular complications 10 years later, but yet I can recall 20 years ago, I approached my OBGYN colleagues. They didn't want to talk about that. They'd gotten their patient through their pregnancy. It was a safe delivery. They didn't want anyone to really discuss an increased potential risk for patients. So really increasing that awareness, being more proactive about early diagnosis and prevention, as well as women often delay seeking treatment, to empower women with the knowledge that, yes, their mild indigestion might be a heart attack. They should seek treatment for that and present earlier.
Jess, I might pick on you a little bit because you've been a little quiet, but I know as someone who works on a bunch of different types of technology and has to lead a number of clients in that direction, obviously startups, they come to an organization like yours and say, okay, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I have to do, go make this work in this budget. I'm fairly certain you have to lead them in a lot of ways to say, nope, we're gonna need to do this many more patients, this many more studies, and you really need to understand the impact. How do you kind of take a look at holistically different types of products and plan out that product development process?
So a lot of these startups too, they start up because there is an unmet market. There's an unmet need that a lot of these places are very passionate about. Like most startups are very small companies. They're less than 10 people. They've seen a need, whether it's reproductive health or something else, where they are like, we know we can develop a technology here that's helpful. The issue with startups too is a lot of them are novel technologies. So they have to go a whole different way with their submission strategy. Luckily with the FDA and de novo now, they can kind of get away from like doing a full-scale clinical trial, but they still have to do a subset of that. So telling them that they need to talk to X many users, X many patients, and then just build up their databases. Yes, there's a lot of these databases that are existing already and they can get the knowledge from that, but a lot of them don't exist. So they have to do the upfront work, which is time, which is money, which is trying to find that patient base. So working with those startups, we try to help with that. We do recruitment in that way for them, especially for human factors. We have a whole department that is primarily just human factors. To either it's our own internal population pool, because it's, we've done that where we send out emails, hey, women of Goddard, who has some time to like comment on these? Or again, one product I've been working with is an intermittent urinary catheter that's got both female and male users, and female anatomy is variable. There is no set data on it on average like lengths and things like that for anatomy. So we've looked at our pool, we've done community outreach programs, and luckily through social media and networking that way, we're able to get that data. But it's time, it's money. It's very difficult to then go back to the startups and say, hey, this is gonna take you 3 more months. We need to find these patients, we need to find these users. And then you throw COVID into everything too, and then you just can't get to talk to surgeons at all.
That's a whole
and it makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Rachel, I wonder, could I ask you a question? Because as I've kind of been researching this topic, there's a lot of talk about, simulators and models and other types of tools where you might not necessarily be enrolling an actual patient. And I wonder, what's the viability of that? Has anybody thought of that? Is it too scary to even consider? Because I wonder if this is kind of the new way, right? It's something that I know is being, in my own company, things that we're looking at. How do we simulate, the eye and how the eye might behave so that maybe we're not enrolling as many patients as we might need. So I don't know, I just wonder if that's a way could that work for women? I don't know.
Not to steal the question from you, but
No,
I've
go.
actually done a lot.
No, that's all you.
So I've done a lot of work on tissue studies. I worked in electrophysiology for many years in breast oncology and trying to find tissue surrogates. Like, what can we do on the bench, upfront engineering work, that we then don't have to go into animal studies or clinical trials and using it on humans? Like, what can we do on the bench, simulated tissue, whether it's made with a gel or things like that that could be done for surgery that emulate that, so we're not wasting money, wasting time doing cadaver studies, things like that. So there is a lot of out there and a lot of research out there on tissue surrogates and anatomical models, whether it's for like cardiac silicone heart models or things like that. So there is a lot of universities do that. I know like the University of Minnesota has the Visual Heart Lab where they have hundreds of thousands of heart MRI data that they then use and have this whole database of virtual hearts. So for pacemaker placement, they use that database and they have averages there. So a lot of universities are looking into that, to how do we develop these databases that startups, research facilities could then use.
Love it.
Yeah. I don't think that, so we use a lot of variety of simulators, and it depends on where we are in the engineering design process. So, of course, there are still preclinical studies, and there's a lot of efforts to try to get away from doing so many preclinical studies. So as you mentioned, there are in silico models, so there can be computational models that you can completely do and make sure you're using something that's validated, or you can do bench models that are more in vitro versus the in vivo studies. A lot of these, though, are to help refinement of the engineering design. When you talk about a replacement for clinical trials, that's a little bit of a different challenge, because this is being able to simulate a very complex patient system. It's never just about the fit. It's never just about what is the bio or blood compatibility. This is what is it over time with a patient who has everything else that's going on and all the hospital and environmental factors. So, I know that there's been a lot in the future that we've talked about building out large databases of well-known diseases to be able to build a virtual patient so that you can have a virtual patient clinical study. But at least right now, where we're in our engineering design, we use it a lot more in the engineering design early on than getting ready for doing our virtual patient clinical trials with a true form device.
But the more you can utilize cost-effective resources early on in the product design, then the more impactful the product clinical trial can be, right? That the more you can spend later, right? Especially if you're looking at it from the breadth of a product. The more you can get creative in the beginning and get the data you need to prove safety and efficacy, the more you can run with the product.
And very specific to what we're speaking about today, right? When you can build your own bench model, you're not going out trying to find an animal that's specific to the size or the geometric constraints. You can make sure that you're building a bench model and you have the wide range, which includes sex-specific differences in anatomy.
Okay, so one more thing before we move on from this bullet point, just a comment and love your thoughts on this. The health of women often gets lumped into women's health issues. But the reality is there are a number of conditions and issues outside of specific female organs, and they affect women differently than men. Obviously, we've talked about the heart being one of them, the eye, potentially, but how do we keep this conversation from being an initiative that focuses on reproductive issues? That's a big question. Also, comments from the audience are welcome for this one.
I still think it's about getting those sex-specific trials published. Again, Bobby, who taught me that there's such a big difference that 1 in every 4, I think, when you compare to men, is the number of heart transplants that's available for women. Yet when you look at the size of heart failure population that is in women, it's almost equivalent. It's just, I think, getting the information through the studies out there to keep the conversation going, to make sure it's not just about the baby making.
And I think empowering women to understand what are their health risks. Many women were completely unaware their greatest health threat was cardiovascular disease, and they were much more concerned about their screening mammograms and the risk of breast cancer, again, because that's more around the reproductive component of women's health. That more, when you surveyed women 10 years ago, the majority of women felt like their greatest risk was breast cancer, not cardiovascular disease. So again, working with other organizations like American Heart Association, going directly to patients to educate patients about these are your biggest health threats. And let's face it, men tend to be much more proactive about prevention through executive health plans, and women are often caregivers and they're concerned about everyone else in the family and are less proactive about their own health.
Yeah, so true. Okay, any comments before we move on from this one? Oh, yes. Oh, Mike is coming.
Hi there. As a cisgendered woman in the LGBTQ community, I find it very interesting that they called out gender in this. And so far, we haven't really addressed that. When I look at this, of course, as part of that community, I think, oh, this is fantastic. You know, they're starting to consider gender. Then as a quality and regulatory professional, I go into a little bit of a panic. And I'm like, okay, now what do they really want from me? You know, what output are they going to be expecting, the FDA being they? And I do kind of wonder whether this is a bit of a fishing expedition on the FDA's part to put this guidance out there and say, hey, look, we're going to start looking at this data and to see what kind of data they're going to start getting from the community or the medical device community. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
My first thought is that fishing isn't necessarily bad, but it's a first place to start. Because I agree with you, and I think one of the things we talk about in the last bullet point, it's a lot of vague, but that's what initiative is, right? It's not a requirement, it's not a regulation, it's we want to take proactive steps to try to understand this. And I think that is really crucial and important. What it's gonna come down to, in my opinion, is how the people in this room go about deciding what that means and implementing it and giving feedback, right? Because we should all be giving FDA feedback on this type of thing and asking a lot of questions. So I'm hopeful that by having a lot of conversations like this and getting excellent comments and saying, okay, what about X, Y, and Z, we can tell the FDA what we think it should be and what we think they should be asking. And you know, I found FDA is pretty decent to listen. They like comments, they like feedback. So that's just my personal take on it. I think it's good to start somewhere, but we've got to figure out how it's actually implemented.
I'll comment as well, because I also think FDA has had a mechanism in place, right, where they can, in some ways, control for this, right? I mean, they're reviewing IDEs before companies are executing clinical trials, right? They're looking at your statistical analysis plan. They're looking at, you know, your patient, your potential patient population, right? They're looking at your study data through your PMAs or your de novo applications, et cetera, right? They have mechanisms in place to comment on this and address this, right? So maybe, you know, this is another way to just exploit something that's been perhaps long overlooked or focused on. But, you know, in my mind, I also think about that. It's like, well, hey, wait a second. You've been reviewing IDEs for all of these medical devices for many, many, many years, right? You're giving companies feedback as to the patient representation and whether or not it's appropriate and that kind of thing. So just another side of things, I also think some of this is just long overdue. It's press for the agency. It's an area that they should be looking at and exploring. Women's health is very front and center now, and it's been overlooked for a long time. But I in some ways, not fishing, but I very much appreciate your perspective, because as a regulator, I sit back and I think, okay, wait a minute. Like I've had to justify this for years in trials, right? And now all of a sudden it's an initiative, but again, I think it's moving in the right direction. I really do.
Yeah, and this initiative too is really pointing out that there is an underserved community here. Like there is a diverse population that is not being considered as part of design and clinical trials. And to your point, is this now going to be a stepping stone for the LGBTQ community, for those who are also have a voice that's not being heard, but over the course of even the last 5 years, that community is being a louder voice and advocating for their health much more, as women have been as well. So I think this could just be a stepping stone for further initiatives for the FDA, for these underserved communities who are vocal about their health, the patients are, but the technology isn't there for them either. So I think a lot of companies now need to look to these underserved markets that are just being left on the table. Like, that's money too, at the end of it.
Excellent comment, thank you. Okay, so we've got just about 10 minutes left to talk through this last bullet point. And this one is the one I think is the, how do we actually do this bullet point? It's regarding a research roadmap. So develop a guide for navigating the health of women medical device ecosystem. Wouldn't we all like that ecosystem guide? Address identified gaps and unmet needs related to the health of women through targeted resources, and promote advancement of regulatory science related to the health of women. So let's talk about how we actually make this actionable, because I think it's a great thought process, but How can we as an industry be identifying unmet needs more effectively, especially when they're outside our typical scope? And by that I mean each group has a focus, right? Companies have a very specific focus of unmet needs that they are looking for. But they also have access to data and visualization of other potential priorities and unmet needs. So how can we as an industry be contributing to a broader conversation around unmet needs when it comes to women's health, or the health of women?
Well, I think certainly this forum is the first step, and really bringing together people we would never cross paths with unless we were all here affiliated with Mass Medicus. So thank you for that. Also working with AVIMED. AVIMED's been a great partner for us at Abiomed. It's a safe space where we can collaborate with other industry partners to see how they are expanding diversity in their clinical trials and how they're overcoming barriers, so we can learn from each other in a safe space that we can easily share our best practices.
Any other thoughts? What we should be doing better? I mean, I'm thinking specifically, right, what, outside of cardiac, right, what do you have access to, your doctors are seeing the inside of the body, right, the inside of the human body. You're talking to patients outside of the eye, you've got access to a lot. How can we share that information with each other? I mean, how can companies kind of cross that line to say, this is never gonna be a product for us, but how do I make sure that this is an initiative and a product or an unmet need that is not overlooked?
I think it's similar to what Bobby said, but maybe it's a little bit more into having the conversation about the databases or the data that we have available, right? So there's one point about talking about the way that we're doing our clinical studies and trials and how we've done our strategy and what's been working and what's not. And the other side of that is also what is the data that we have available? How are we designing our devices? What do our trial data collects? And I think, again, in that safe space of partnerships either with Mass Device or with AdvaMed, in a place where we know that we're trying to benefit and have a conversation about what can be shared and what can be potentially beneficial for a company for a specific population in need.
Can I ask for, and this is just my personal question, what makes a safe space? So if we were, groups are doing this, what are they doing well? And so what makes it a good forum for conversation? And I think this is in general.
It's a good question, right? What is a safe space? So many answers in that. I'm going to speak from an engineering side, right?
Yeah.
So obviously IP, and we have an amazing intellectual property attorney here, Nona. If you haven't met her, she's amazing, and she's always coming down on me hard if I'm in conversations with anybody, including physicians, right? And suddenly I have an idea. She's like, when did that idea come? And I think that's a little bit of the part about the safe space, right? There's intellectual property, which is very important to industry. It is one of our main remedies. So I think it's, when we talk about a safe space, I think it's having those types of ground rules, having an understanding as to what conversations we can engage in, at least from an engineering perspective.
That's very good. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So I kind of wanted to close out with one last question. When companies, and this could be a generalization, and please no one get offended if I talk about the pediatrics market and in a general way, but when companies are working to discover unmet needs, they aren't gender specific, right? You're looking for, as we said, an unmet need for the biggest population. How do we make sure that the health of women doesn't become somewhat generally what's happened in the pediatric space, where there's just not a big enough market to justify innovation? I think we've talked about it a little bit, but are there any kind of things we need to be on the lookout for and make sure that we're doing to make sure that women and gender issues are not disregarded when it comes to unmet needs?
And I think that points to our advocacy partners, and we're fortunate to have Melissa, who's worked with Representative Trahan to ensure that this does make it into policy. And this is where the FDA and CMS are pushing increased diversity, meeting the unmet clinical needs of women and other underserved populations. And so right now it's considered a luxury often to enroll a more diverse population in your clinical trials, but it's not going to be long before it's a requirement. And to be able to start this conversation, be proactive about increasing the diversity in your trials is critically important because it's going to represent a better real-world population that we ultimately serve.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did have one question come at the audience before we close out. And this is a very specific one for design. So when designing wearables, is there a big difference between what form factor works for patients that are male versus female?
This is an interesting one, and it's actually one that Bobby and I have been discussing a little bit, and we're probably going to be challenged to discuss a lot more in the next coming years. So, you know, when we're thinking about a wearables, or if it's something that's a take-home device, obviously the patient has to have parts of the device that sit outside the body on them. Now, where do you have it on you? Where is somewhere that's a form that can fit well for both male and female that's still comfortable? You can think about as I need to stop doing that. Is the just okay, right? Is there a region where it just doesn't fit well? So the example I'm going to give is we may have a take-home device in the future that has a mobile controller, and we've been talking about a vest. Okay, if we have a vest for a female patient, where would we put the mobile controller? Where is it going to sit that's comfortable, and is that different from where it would sit on a male? So I do think that there are, when you talk about disposables or devices that people are going home with, wearables, there are forms and functions that do fit differently, and you may even have to be specific or include the modularity or the adaptability in your design to fit in different places that are comfortable for patients.
And to that regard, we actually talked about battery and battery size. So if you look at a 6'6", 300-pound man, and I remember I was out in the field and ran into a patient of mine who's been on a durable VAD for over 10 years. She actually just reached her 15th year, but she's 90 pounds and tiny, and she comes up to my shoulder. So when I showed that picture to the engineers, they're like, oh my gosh, I've got to design something that fits this 6'6", 300-pound man, but that will also work for this 90-pound, 5-foot woman. And that's a challenge for our engineers to design a device and a wearable that's going to meet both patient populations.
Any other comments or questions from the audience before we wrap? Oh, Brian's got a question.
Thank you. Great conversation. I'm curious, what is the percentage of women that are physicians who specialize in heart issues and cardiac clinicians? And I would assume it's primarily a male-dominated industry, cardiology, but have those ratios improved, and how much of a factor do you guys think that is?
I do think it's a huge factor. When I entered cardiology, 5% of cardiologists were women. We see a particularly underserved number of physicians in interventional cardiology and even lower in cardiac surgery. Now, surprisingly, in heart failure cardiology, we're seeing more women, so it's certainly improved. It's still not, it still hasn't crossed the 50% threshold, but we do have more women cardiologists. But again, women still shy away from the more procedural areas like interventional cardiology and cardiac surgery. And it does make a difference. It also makes a difference in clinical trials. And we've made an initiative here at Abiomed to have women in leadership positions for clinical trials because that does exude increased trust among trial participants. And so we just named our first national PI as a woman for our Bridge to Recover trial.
Yeah. So we just need more women.
We need more women.
We just need more women.
Plugged everyone listening. Thank you. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for the comments from the audience. Thank you for everyone joining us virtually. I think we've actually wrapped up just right about time. And I have to say thank you one more time to Abiomed for hosting us. This has been an outstanding forum. For those of you virtually, we miss you. Please join us for the next one. You're missing out on some amazing snacks outside. And thank you again to our sponsors, Sunrise Labs, Boston Engineering, Goddard, Active Surgical, and Sunstein Law. We could not do this without you. Thank you, speakers. This was outstanding. So Stephanie, Sonia, Bobby, and Jessica, thank you again. And everyone, have a wonderful day. We will be networking outside, so feel free to go back to the great snacks.